Hello there, it's Matt from Matt's English. And in this video, my goal or my hope is that I can help you by showing you 10 different ways to describe your childhood, but I'm also hoping to do more than that. I'm hoping to show you ways to think about your language, your English, and your development. So let's have a look at some of the different ways, and hopefully this can help you to build your vocabulary, your some new sentence structures, and also to help you feel more confident. If you are preparing for an IELTS test, or you just want to feel that your language has more variety when you're talking socially, then I hope this video can help you to move to the next level with your English. So, step one, or the most basic step for describing our childhood, is simply to use the past tense, my childhood was. So, simple past plus an adjective. So, my focus in this video is not just to read the examples, but rather to explain how we use them. So my childhood was plus any adjective that is suitable. So my childhood was happy, wonderful, difficult, sad. My childhood was challenging. In the next step, we use the same simple past verb, but we use a superlative adjective. So that is where we choose the highest or the most interesting level of the adjective. So, my childhood was the happiest, the most wonderful, or the saddest time of my life. So, we are focusing on one particular stage that is at the top level of that adjective. Another phrase that we can use is full of. My childhood was full of happiness. My childhood was full of sadness. My own personal childhood was full of adventure. I had a great time. Then we can talk about this stage, period, or time in our lives. So, my childhood was a beautiful stage in my life. My childhood was an amazing period in my life. My childhood was a wonderful time in my life. So this is some different structures that we can use with the simple past, just saying my childhood was. Okay, the next phrase that we'll use to introduce a sentence about your childhood is in my childhood, followed by a subject and the verb. So this could be a clause or it might be a full sentence. In my childhood, we, the subject, always had. So there's your verb. We always had a great time. We never wanted for a thing. In my childhood, my parents, that's a compound plural subject, were so supportive. My brothers and sisters would play together. So we can take any subject and verb that you can use to describe your childhood appropriately. In my childhood, life in Australia was good. Life in Australia was great, and that's very true. But it's not true for everybody. For some people, in my childhood, my country was at war, or there were many problems. In my childhood, my neighbourhood was very poor. We had a difficult life. Okay, now instead of using the word childhood, there's many synonyms that we can use. Some examples include describing the stage of our life, my early years, my primary school years, my teens, my adolescence. Part of our childhood is our upbringing. We are raised or brought up by our parents. So my upbringing was amazing. My upbringing was full of adventure. My upbringing was a very challenging period in my life. In English, the years when we are being formed, the years when our body and our minds start to develop. So really, when we're from the ages of 0 or 1 to about 8 years of age, we really call these our formative years. But our formative years can really describe any stage in our childhood because we are still developing. So, in my formative years, my parents gave me lots of freedom to explore and do anything that I wanted to do. If we're talking about our very young years, our baby period, we can say in my infancy. And if we're talking about the childhood of others, we can say in my brother's or my sister's infancy. We can also just use I, the subject. I grew up. I grew up in a happy home. I spent my early years living with my grandparents. Okay, so I grew up, I spent, followed by a subject and a verb. I grew up, or a prepositional phrase. I grew up in a happy home. I spent my early years living with my grandparents. Okay, step number 4. We have the same thing with a subject and verb, but we have the phrase at the start of the sentence, or it can be at the end of the sentence. We were happy during my childhood. But here I think it works well. During my childhood, we were happy. During my childhood, we lived in a big house. We can also talk about the time frame, the years that we lived through. During my younger years, my teens, my primary school years, anything like that. We can talk about the state of the country, our house, or the place where we lived. During my childhood, Australia was considered as a lucky country. Now, if you had a hard time during my childhood, the country experienced a revolution, a war, a recession. There are many bad things that can happen during some people's childhood. We can also talk about the time in general, or the way that we thought the world was. So, for me, personally, during my younger years, the world was much simpler. I can say during my childhood, the world always seemed much simpler than it does now. Okay, a very good way to talk about different things is to think about different sensations or emotions. So, with our childhood, we always had a lot of feelings, and it's good to describe the way that you felt. So, past tense, simple past, and felt or to feel is an irregular past tense verb. So, how did you feel? I felt happy, free, amazing. So, I felt plus an adjective or two adjectives. I felt full of life and energy. There are other phrases that we can use. So, I felt as free as a bird, or I felt as happy as could be, as I could be. I felt that I could do whatever I wanted, or I felt trapped in a dysfunctional family. So, a dysfunctional family is a family that's not working well together. It can be a sad family or a family with problems. We describe them as a dysfunctional family. Also, we have some special feelings when we're young. We feel indestructible. I felt that I would never grow up, or I felt free so that I could rule the world. I could do anything that I wanted. Now, some people don't like childhood, and they feel, or they would say, I felt that I could not wait to grow up and be independent or to make my own money. Step number 6, we can talk about our own, or we can talk about the expectations, hopes, and dreams of others. For example, our parents have expectations. My parents raised me to be a good, responsible person. So my parents raised me to be, plus an adjective. I was brought up. So that's what my parents wanted me to be. I was brought up to be hardworking. I was brought up to be a good person. What did your parents want? I have many students whose parents wanted them to be a doctor or a lawyer. So we can use a noun, what position. They wanted me to be an engineer, or we can use an adjective. My parents wanted me to be successful or rich. My parents wanted me to be happy. What about our own hopes? I hope to be a writer or an architect, or our dreams. I always dreamed of being a zoologist, studying animals in the zoo. I know many girls, or ladies now, who wanted to be dancers, or dreamed of being a painter, a banker. My dream was to be a carpenter and build a house. Or my dream was to travel the world, or make lots of money. These are our expectations, hopes, and dreams. We can also pay special attention to our special memories. Excuse me. The things that we found most important, or that we can remember most clearly in our childhood. For example, my strongest memory is my first day of school, or was my first day of school. My clearest memory was the day I went to work with my father. One thing that's very true for me, I will always remember my grandmother's cakes. They were fantastic. The one thing that I can clearly remember, so this is something that stands out. It's a special memory, and people will be interested in special memories. And if you're doing a test like the IELTS test, it's good to talk about things that we know well. So these are 3 examples of talking about our special memories. Now, when I was, and creating a complex sentence. So when I was a child, I lived in a big house. When I was a child, I played with all of the other kids in my street. We can talk about the way the world was. When I was a child, life was easier. When I was a child, the world seemed like it was full of adventure and challenges. When I was very young, my parents would take us to the park, or my parents would take us to a restaurant. When I was in primary school, when I was in high school, and we can make a sentence. So remember, after we have when I was, that is that's a dependent clause. So we need another clause to follow afterwards. When I was a child, comma, I lived, I played, I worked, or I lived in a big house when I was a child. We can change the word or sentence order with many of these phrases. Okay. We can also talk about the time when we grew up, the place, as in our city, country, suburb, village, town, or our home or the house where we lived. So the 80s, the 1980s, the years were a fantastic time to be young. People who lived through wars or problems might say life was very difficult in the late 60s in my country. The revolution era was part of my childhood, and it really changed the way that my parents thought. I lived in a small village. I lived in a big city. I lived in a village where there was no water, no electricity. Anything could have been possible in your childhood. Our family home was very big and old, or maybe it was a tiny shack near the beach. The family apartment, what was it like? We need to use a lot of adjectives to describe the places where we grew up or the places where we developed as a young person. Now, the final stage that we can also use is to describe the things that we used to do. I used to visit my grandmother. Okay, I used to always visit my grandmother on Sundays. So think about these words like always, often, regularly, frequently. They're great adverbs that can help to describe more about the times that we lived through or the time when we were growing up. We used to go on a holiday in summer every year. We used to ride our bikes in the street and roam around the neighbourhood. Now look at the negative form. Make sure that you're clear that we change when we make it a negative. We didn't used to get into too much trouble. And something that wasn't always true for me, I didn't used to buy my lunch very often. So I hope that you can go through these language structures slowly. It's probably a good idea to pause the video, and for each of the different 10 steps, and you might know them all, but write down some example sentences of your own about your own upbringing, your own childhood, and then practice putting them all together. You might know each step individually, but we're trying to build is variety with your language structures. So try to use all 10 at once, and then hopefully you do well. And if you'd like to, you can let me know how you go in the comments section. Okay, everybody, thank you, and I'll post another video soon.